Our first reading today comes from Genesis 21, 8 through 21, from the Common English Bible. The boy grew and stopped nursing. On the day he stopped nursing, Abraham prepared a huge banquet. Sarah saw Hagar's son laughing, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, "Send this servant away with her son. This servant's son won't share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." This upset Abraham terribly because the boy was his son. God said to Abraham, "Don't be upset about the boy and your servant. Do everything Sarah tells you to do because your descendants will be traced through Isaac. But I will make of your servant's son a great nation too, because he is also your descendant." Abraham got up early in the morning. He took some bread and a single flask of water and gave it to Hagar. He put the boy in her shoulder sling and sent her away. She left and wandered through the desert near Beersheba. Finally, the water in the flask ran out, and she put the boy down under one of the desert shrubs. She walked away from him about as far as a bow shot and sat down, telling herself, "I can't bear to see my boy die." She sat at a distance and cried out in grief and wept. God heard the boy's cries, and God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cries over there. Get up, pick up the boy, and take him by the hand, because I will make of him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw well. She went over and filled the flask and gave the boy a drink. God remained with the boy. He grew up, lived in the desert, and became an expert archer. He lived in the Paran desert, and his mother found him an Egyptian wife. Thus ends the first reading. The second reading comes from Matthew 10, 24 through 39. Disciples aren't greater than their teacher, and slaves aren't greater than their master. It's enough for disciples to be like their teacher and slaves like their master. If they called the head of the house Beelzebul, it's certain that they will call the members of his household by even worse names. Therefore, don't be afraid of those whom nothing is hidden that won't be revealed, and nothing secret that won't be brought out into the open. What I say to you in the darkness, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, announce from the rooftops. Don't be afraid of those who kill the body but can't kill the soul. Instead, be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Aren't 2 sparrows sold for a small coin? But not one of them will fall to the ground, even without your Father already knowing. Even the hairs on your head are all counted. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Therefore, everyone who acknowledges me before people, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But everyone who denies me before people, I will also deny before my Father in heaven. Don't think that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I haven't come to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. People's enemies are members of their own households. Therefore, those who love father or mother more than me aren't worthy of me. Those who love son or daughter more than me aren't worthy of me. Those who don't pick up their crosses and follow me aren't worthy of me. Those who find their lives will lose them, and those who lose their lives because of me will find them. The word of God for the people of God. So every year during Ramadan, Muslims around the world fast from sunup to sundown. Raise your hand if you've driven past the Islamic Center on St. John's Bluff this past month or so. They have huge tents out, don't they? And if you go after sundown, you'll see a whole bunch of people gathered, eating most of the time. I don't know if they do it every night, but I've noticed that it's normally happening. The fast is meant to allow Muslims to seek nearness and to look for forgiveness from God, to express their gratitude to and dependence on Him, atone for their past sins, and to remind them of the needy. Now, as you can imagine, one of the things that Muslims look forward to during their fast is what? Eating at the end of the day. And they can't do it until sunset at all. They don't drink water, they don't eat, unless you have various conditions that require you to eat, or if you're little. But this is a celebratory meal, referred to as an iftar dinner. Now, Holly, Leela, and I were invited to a dinner by some visitors that we had not too long ago in our church. We sat at table with this lovely family, and Leela made some new friends with apparently some really shy boys that don't make friends easily. We came to realize that there's much more in common between us than there is different. As we spoke about parenting, we found that we had many of the same struggles: picky eaters, shy children who pretend to be shy. As we spoke about life and the world around us, we came to realize that we have many of the same worries. And the gift of sitting at the table with this family was a true honor. And in light of today's passage, it makes me begin to wonder about how sometimes we're encountering angels and are not even aware of it. I feel like this passage itself cuts in at the very end of the tale of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. In order for us to really get into it, though, we have to get back a little. Take 2 or 3 steps back. One of the things I love about the Bible, especially the Hebrew Scriptures, is that we as readers are never left doubting the real, authentic humanity of those we find within its pages. And if we're being honest, some of the most real figures that we'll find in the Bible are Abraham and Sarah. One thing is for sure, I didn't walk away from this passage thinking, wow, if only I were able to act as godly as Sarah and Abraham. They have struggles, don't they? Struggles that you and I can relate to, not knowing if we're doing the right thing, seeking God's help. It all begins, of course, when Sarah tells Abraham to go to her servant Hagar so that she may provide Abraham with children. This is an awkward situation to the modern reader. Raise your hand if you always feel embarrassed for Abraham when it happens. I always do. How many circumstances in our life would we find anything like this? It's unheard of and, quite frankly, seems wrong. Now, the passages have been explored by many scholars, and the general consensus is that the relationship between Abraham and Sarah was consensual. They both wanted to be involved with each other. And this is simply because the words used in the passage lead us to believe that. It's not just people guessing. So if we throw out that theory that Abraham forced Hagar to do anything, and scholars have spent a lot of time on this, I promise, it leaves us wondering why a servant would accept this sort of relationship willingly. Now, the answer can be found in the Midrash, the tales that accompany the Hebrew Scriptures. There's a traditional story that accompanies this set of scriptures that tells us Hagar's backstory. And Hagar's backstory, as you can imagine, is a little bit on the light side, if you rely solely on the book of Genesis. And this is how Midrash came into being. For Hagar, the Midrash accounts tell her background as being much more than that of an Egyptian servant. In the Midrash, Hagar is none other than a daughter of Pharaoh. In this tradition, Sarah and Hagar get to know each other, wherein Sarah is part of Pharaoh's harem. And Pharaoh came to give Hagar to Sarah as a servant during this time, stating, "It's better that my daughter should be a servant in the house of such a woman than a mistress in another house." Sarah did not treat Hagar as an ordinary slave. She, according to the Midrash, kept very close company with her as a friend, as they did in Pharaoh's household. Now, when Sarah grew impatient of waiting for God's promise to be fulfilled, this is eventually what led to Abraham taking Hagar as a wife. This union led to Hagar becoming pregnant. And with this pregnancy came a drastic change in the relationship between Hagar and Sarah. Sarah begins to treat Hagar very harshly, and this caused Hagar to run away from Sarah. It was in this time when Hagar was in the wilderness that she encounters the Lord. Now, this is significant because this is the first person, male or female, to encounter the Lord in the wilderness. It is the result of this encounter that the wilderness becomes a place where we find God. Hagar's relationship with and attitudes towards Sarah is redefined at this very moment. She also, because of this encounter, received the right to name God. This name is El Roi, or God who sees. Now, if we fast forward, God then appears to Abraham and makes his covenant with him. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. Sarah becomes pregnant and gives birth to Isaac against all the odds. And on the day that Isaac stopped nursing, Abraham throws a banquet in honor of Isaac. It was at that moment that Sarah realized that Isaac's inheritance was in trouble. So she grew jealous and said to Abraham, "Cast out this woman, so that her child may not inherit what is my son Isaac's." And though this distressed Abraham, God instructed him to do whatever Sarah told him to do. So Abraham wakes up the next morning early and gives Hagar a single loaf of bread and a single skin of water and sends her and Ishmael out into the wilderness. And once again, it's in the wilderness where Hagar encounters God. And in this account, as we see in Genesis 16, water has meaning. Abraham gives Hagar an amount that is far too little to quench two people's thirsts. This suggests that Abraham was telling her that her dependency and her son's dependency on Sarah and Abraham was over, and that she was to rely upon God alone. This next passage relays what I argue is perhaps the least acknowledged and most underappreciated divine encounter in the whole of Christianity. And when the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under the bushes. And she sat down and she cried. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." I say that this is one of the most underappreciated because it tells us about the compassion that God had. And it shows us a comparison to what we find in the Quran, the same story. In the Quranic narrative, Hagar was the daughter of the Egyptian king who came to live with Abraham, who was given a slightly different name. And Sarah, he did all this because he thought that Sarah was his sister, if we recall. They said that in the Bible too. Now Ishmael's birth to Hagar caused strife once again to Sarah, who was barren. Abraham brought Hagar and their son to what would later become known as Mecca. And this objective of this journey being to resettle rather than expel Hagar. And it was then that Abraham left Hagar and Ishmael under a tree and provided them with water. Hagar, learning that God ordered Abraham to leave her in the desert near what was to be known as Mecca, respected this decision. Muslims believe that God ordered Abraham to do this in order to test Abraham's obedience to God's commands. Soon Hagar was out of water, and Ishmael, an infant at that time, began to die. And Hagar panicked and ran between two hills in search for water. After her seventh run, Ishmael hit the ground and caused a well to spring up. This is the story of their survival. This incident and other things are portrayed by Muslims in their annual Hajj to Mecca. Part of the pilgrimage is to do just as Sarah did, to run between the hills 7 times in commemoration of Hagar's courage, and to symbolize the celebration of motherhood in Islam, as well as the leadership of women. Some Muslims also drink from the very well that they believe was sprung by God through Ishmael, and to take some of the water back home from their pilgrimage. So the question here is, though, where is our lesson? Is it in Abraham or Ibrahim? Who was more faithful? Where is the lesson best learned by our church today, applicable to modern Christianity? I know that in the church today, we often find ourselves in situations that seem like we are being sent out into the desert with only 1 skin of water and 1 loaf of bread. Certainly it seems like we're too often charged with tasks that are impossible, beyond our capabilities. Budgets that refuse to balance, committees that don't fill themselves very easily, buildings that were once the center and life of a large church and now are not. These are the problems that plague churches across the country, across denomination, across theologies, the church down the street, the church across the world. I can't imagine how Hagar felt on that day as she cast Ishmael down and gave up hope in the very God whom she had encountered in the wilderness not too many years before. But haven't we all had that moment where utter despair takes over and we lose all hope? Haven't we all lost hope at one point or another, even though we know the response that we're supposed to have? Whether these moments of despair have to do with the church, your career, your family, your finances, or your faith. Remember that Hagar wasn't sent out into the wilderness to die lost and alone. This is true in the Genesis narrative and in the narrative we find in the Quran. Hagar was sent into the wilderness and was protected and cared for by an all-powerful God. The God who gave her provision when she needed it most. An encounter with the divine is nothing to scoff at. It's not as rare as one might think. Certainly, it may not always look like the television production with wings or a light turning on right as you're revealing yourself. But we as Reformed people believe that we are part of a priesthood of all believers, a communion of saints. The implications of this simple belief are that we are charged with becoming the hands and feet of Christ in our surrounding communities. And to all those whom we encounter, we are called to be radical followers of Christ. The challenge that I believe we are being issued in this passage today is that we are to become the means through which people come to encounter the divine. What does that challenge mean to you? How does that change the way your family lives their everyday life? How does that change our church, that we are to become the means through which people encounter the divine? Remember that water in the wilderness was not the end of Hagar and Ishmael's story. It was the beginning. God promised what was fulfilled in Ishmael, that he was the father of a nation. God has great work to do through us where we are, and perhaps has something very special planned for each one of us in this room today. All we have to do is listen and be faithful to that still small voice that calls us to do the difficult things. Amen.